Hello and welcome to a brief revision session looking at the impact of war on Britain. In particular, we're going to focus on the changing role of women and how that's affected by the impact of World War One and World War Two in particular. Okay, so let's look at the role of women before World War One and the life that they would have had, so that we can compare or at least contrast their roles in World War One with what it was like beforehand, and consider how big an impact the wars actually had on their lives. So before World War One, most men and women believed that a woman's place was in the home. Married women were not expected to work. Women who worked in professional jobs such as teaching were forced to give up work when they married. Some working class women had to continue to work to supplement a family's income. These women worked in unskilled jobs, like in the textile industry, so doing things like sewing. They were always paid less than men, even if they did exactly the same job. For unmarried women, the choice of occupation was very limited. Many women worked in domestic service, so in households, doing sort of jobs like cleaning and cooking, as maids, cooks to the wealthy households, and some worked in caring professions such as teaching and nursing. This wasn't something that was expected of wealthy women at all. Few girls received any real education. Most who went to school would have learnt cooking, needlework, and basic arithmetic and reading. By the end of the 19th century, 2 Oxford colleges had started accepting women, so there were some steps forward in education and things like that before the World Wars, but they wouldn't give them a degree at the end of their studies. So even if they had gone to university, they would never get the same title or recognition as men. Socially, women were expected to take a chaperone with them when they went out, so that meant they were expected to take either another woman, a female friend, or another family member with them, so they were never out on their own. This was usually an older female relative. Smoking and drinking was not considered acceptable, and clothing was very restrictive. Skirts were supposed to be very long and cover the whole of their body, and they wore their hair very long and tied up in elaborate styles. This all restricted their movement, so it made things like playing sport impossible. So that's what life was like for women before World War One. So let's have a quick look and remind ourselves what impact World War One actually has on their lives. Okay, so let's see how much women were affected by war during World War One. Many women played an important role on the home front during World War One. In employment, they kept many industries running as men went off to fight. So there were many roles that needed filling, in particular in factories, and also some women did join the armed forces. Munitions work was about 60% of all workers in munitions, so factories that made weapons and things like that. 60% of the workers in those munition factories were women. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, and the work was very dangerous and very different if you think about the war that they were doing before the war. The work that they were doing before the war. So previously they might have been doing sewing jobs, being maids, cooking, kitchen work, teaching, nursing, all very traditional female roles in the household largely, and looking after sort of caring roles. This kind of work is dangerous and something which traditionally men would have been doing. There were accidents and explosions which were sometimes fatal, and the chemicals they worked with were poisonous. It often dyed the skin and the hair of the workers yellow, which got them nicknamed canaries, and some women died from the poisoning, lead poisoning, as a result of the munitions work that they did. There was growing independence during World War One. For women who worked regularly, life really changed. So some women had to wear more practical clothing. So you can see in this image they're no longer wearing sort of long skirts and things like that. They've got much more practical clothing on. Some of them even wore trousers, which was at the time quite a daring thing to do. It seems very masculine, but it was much easier and more practical for them to do so, to do their jobs. A lot of women also began to cut their hair much shorter, as it seemed much more practical than having to spend time tying your hair up or having it loose. And some women even wore uniforms as well, something which was much less common previously, although there might have been some uniforms in jobs like nursing. They also gained more freedom. there were fewer men around, so it became much more acceptable for women to go out without a chaperone, to buy their round of drinks or to pay for a meal. So previously, where women might have been expected to be chaperoned in case they met a man and they were single and needed to be watched out for and that sort of thing, much less likely because most of the young men would have gone to fight. And also, it's much more acceptable for women to buy a round of drinks or to pay for their own meal, because although traditionally that would have been bought for them by their partner or a family member, those partners, those husbands would have been at war, so therefore it was okay for women to be paying for those things themselves. Many women now smoked and also went to the cinema or went shopping unsupervised, and some older people didn't think this was right, even though men had gone to war and women were doing the jobs. So although lots of young women or younger women might have had these newfound freedoms, not everyone would have approved of it. So you're likely to see different sources with different points of view. Some perhaps written from an older person's more traditional perspective, some perhaps written from the perspective of people who were working and doing these new jobs and taking on these new roles and seeing more change. The troops returning from the front were absolutely amazed at the changes too. So men returning from war who'd sort of been sold the idea of go to war to protect your family, and these sort of helpless women coming back and finding women in very masculine roles and doing what was traditionally seen as quite masculine pursuits and paying for their own meals and going out without chaperones. They would have been quite shocked because that's not what they thought that they'd gone to war to protect. So how far did the position of women change after World War One? Well, many of the changes women encountered during World War One didn't last after the end of the war, although there were some changes that continued. Before the very end of the war, we saw the Representation of the People Act being passed, so right at the end of World War One. And it's in 1918, and we see that women in 1918 are finally, if they're aged 30 and over, given the right to vote, and also all men aged over the age of 21. For the first time, women therefore had gained the right to vote, but they were still not equal to men. Many young women were very angry that the age limit stopped them from voting, and actually a lot of younger women would have been the ones who were working and doing those very different jobs during World War One. So the fact that women aged over 30 were being given the vote wouldn't necessarily reflect the changes or the groups of women who would have seen changes during World War One. So young women working in factories might have had a very different lifestyle during World War One, but then actually in terms of their political position after World War One, things hadn't changed very much. So many young women were still angry. The government claimed the reason was that they believed young women were too foolish to use their vote properly. So even though young women had been doing really vital war work in World War One, they haven't really been accepted by the government to be sort of trusted. The real reason was probably that the government were afraid that if too many women had the right to vote, they would elect a larger number of women MPs, and that was likely to happen in the years after the war, as so many men had been killed and died fighting, that it was more likely there would be more women going into Parliament. The first woman MP was called Nancy Astor and was MP for Plymouth. The social position of women started to change as well after World War One. So women generally had more freedom after the war. Young women now went out without a chaperone. Fashions did become more practical. Skirts were shorter. Many women cut their hair shorter. And some women even dared to wear bathing costumes on the beach, which was something not seen before. Previously, they would have still had sort of totally covered clothing. The most extreme fashion change was flappers. They would wear really, really short skirts, revealing clothes, lots and lots of makeup and very short hair. And they drank and smoked in public. And they danced new dances like the Charleston. And it was all seen as very vulgar by older people, but the younger people sort of do see changes in fashion continue and changes in socially more than politically, in being able to go out on their own. Women did gain some legal rights as well. So the Married Women's Property Act in 1925, so a few years there after the war, we're looking about 7 years later, allowed women to hold and dispose of their property in the same way as their husbands, and women were given equal divorce rights in cases of adultery. However, how much those new Women's Property Acts and the sort of legal changes were down to war is questionable, really, as it's 7 years in between the end of the war and women being given these opportunities. So I would argue perhaps this is more as a result of political pressure of women now that they've got the vote, rather than necessarily the impact of war itself, recognising women to have the rights to equal sort of treatment as to men. In terms of employment, although many women wished to continue work they were doing during the war, when the war ended they were expected to give up work and return to being a housewife and a mother. Women who fought against this were forced out of work and sometimes even physically attacked. So married women really were being forced back into that traditional housewife role. The government believed that jobs should be returned to the soldiers coming back from the front. Women who did stay in work returned to unskilled, low-paid jobs that they had done before the war, and women continued to be paid less than men, even if they were doing the same job. So pay wasn't equal as a result of the war work. And although people have been thankful during the war that women did those necessary jobs, there's still a lot of conservative attitudes about what the correct thing would be for a role for a woman and what she should be doing. So there was some progress. In 1919, a law was passed to make it illegal to bar a woman from a job just because of her sex. So there is that little bit of progress there. This allowed women to enter professions such as medicine and law. However, this only applied to unmarried women. Once a woman was married, she could be forced to give up her job. So unmarried women after World War I did see some increase in ability to have access to different jobs. But even though there's a law being passed, there still would have been a lot of negative thought and negative attitudes, so like being physically attacked, for example, if they were in those jobs. Unmarried women saw a very limited change. So that might be something to consider when you're looking at sources as well, and why they might say slightly different things. So we've started already to talk about the interwar years, 1918 to 1939, in between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II. And we're thinking about how long-lasting and significant the effects of World War I were on women. So some jobs in new and existing industries became considered women's work, such as assembly work and engineering, electrical, food and drink industries, and clerical work, typing and counter sales. However, these jobs were low paid and involved working long hours and shift work. Women workers were usually excluded from supervisory roles, so not in management, or work that was considered skilled, despite the fact that they'd done very successful jobs at skilled work during World War I. So they were able to move into these different types of work, like engineering and electrical industries, which was very different from sewing and maids and cooking and things like that before. But they're not being recognised as having equal ability in skilled roles or in managerial or supervisory roles. By the 1930s, about 1/3 of British women over 15 worked outside the home, of whom nearly 1/3 still worked in domestic service. So of the 1/3 that were working, 1/3 of those were working in domestic service, so maids jobs, cooking, cleaning, etc. However, only 1/10 of married women actually worked. So 1/10 of married women working as opposed to 1/3 of all women. So a much larger percentage of women working were unmarried, like we've talked about. The reason for that is lack of legal protection for women who were married. However, only 1/10 of married women working. Predominant social expectations at the time reinforced the view that caring and cooking was exclusively women's work, and without electrical appliances like washing machines, domestic labour was time-consuming and hard work. For civil service, the education sector and new professions operated a marriage bar. This meant that women who had to resign their posts when they got married. So if you worked in education as a teacher, once you got married, you would have to give up your job. If you worked in the civil service, so for the government, then you would have to give up your job once you got married, etc. And that was the marriage bar. Even those who defied these unofficial rules found that it was impossible to continue working once they had children. Trade unions, which were organisations set up supposed to be looking out for the workers, were led by men and continued to be concerned that women would be employed as cheap labour in these new industries. And if women could be employed as cheap labour, men were worried that that might mean that they would lose their jobs because women could be employed in their place much more cheaply. The wartime demand for wage equality had previously been utilised to recruit women to trade unions. But during the interwar years, most unions actually stopped asking for equal pay for women, drawing back from this demand. Instead, what they actually campaigned for was to restrict women's employment in certain industries altogether, calling for a stricter implementation of the marriage bar within industries. So whilst trade unions had stood up for women's employment and for their equal pay during the war, that doesn't actually last once the men come back from war. So in the interwar years, the goal of equal pay receded, and by 1931, a working woman's weekly wage had returned to the pre-war situation of half that of the male rate in most industries. During this period, women gained the right to vote, and this led to some early attempts to mobilise women's votes on the issue and concern of women, including issues at work. So what I think is really interesting is politically, women over the age of 30 have gained some rights to vote, but that might not necessarily just be as a result of things going on in the interwar years, or World War One, sorry. That might be more as a result of long-term campaigning by groups like the suffragists and the suffragettes, as the younger women who did a lot of the work in World War One and volunteering in World War One weren't actually being recognised politically. And although socially we see some change in fashion, like the flappers, and socially we see a change like not having to go around with chaperones, in terms of the economy and women's ability to work and access to work, there's very limited change. So there might be different roles and jobs that women could take on, but things like the trade unions that had stood up for them during World War One, and the skilled work they had been allowed to do during World War One, we see them losing those opportunities. So trade unions actually actively work against women. Their pay halves, so it goes back to pre-war levels, and the marriage bar is in place, so lots of married women lose their jobs. So only 1/10 of women who are married and 1/3 of women who are not married are in jobs. So what about during World War Two? How much impact did the war have on women during World War Two? Well, let's have a look. So once again, women played a large part in keeping the country running during World War Two, as men are going off to war. Unlike World War One, however, unmarried women were conscripted into war work. So unlike in World War One, where the government relied on volunteering women to take on those roles, they're conscripting women, so forcing them by law to do war work during World War Two. So there's less need to entice them into those industries. Women worked in industry, in agriculture, and in the armed forces, and in many voluntary bodies as well. So there were some women volunteering as well as the conscription. As in World War One, many women worked in munitions. This was well paid, although it was still dangerous work. Women were still paid less than men. In 1943, the Equal Pay Commission was set up, but it had no power, so most employers just ignored it. So the Equal Pay Commission was meant to ask people to give equal pay to women, but if employers ignored it, nothing much happened. Despite this, many women were pleased to do their bit for the war effort. Although the pay was not equal, many women earned much more than they had done in peacetime in the interwar years, so actually pay did go up even though it wasn't equal during World War Two. The average weekly wage before the war was around £2, and during the war some women earned as much as £10 a week in the munitions factories, as it was dangerous work and they wanted to entice people into those roles. Many women also became land girls, working on farms, keeping up the production of food. And this was an even more important job than it had been in World War One, due to the bombing of ports. So areas where ships were coming in, which might have been importing food, and things like wheat, which could be used for bread. Lots of boats were being bombed or hit by German U-boats, so sorts of submarines and things like that. So it was really important that Britain tried to become self-sufficient during World War One, and the job of land girls was one way that they did that. Attitudes of women also did change, so doing war work gave them the confidence and independence that they might not otherwise have had. Many women left home for the first time and were no longer under the watchful eye of their parents, especially if they became land girls, as that would require them to travel into the countryside or wherever they were stationed to do that kind of agricultural work on farms. Trade unions accepted that women workers, perhaps a little bit more readily than they had been in World War One. The Trade Union Committee campaigned to make sure that women workers were treated the same as men, and the government also helped women with childcare commitments. So the government provided nurseries for free for women who were working, and also encouraged firms or offices to offer job sharing schemes. So, for example, if a woman had children, job sharing schemes would enable them to take turns to look after children and also do the war work as well. Despite this, many men still believe that women's jobs were in the home. So you might see different sources, some of which might be governmental sources trying to encourage women into jobs. We've got nurseries, you can job share, it's something that is possible for you. But then you might see men seeing women going into this work and feeling that it wasn't proper. And you might see young women who are quite excited about those new opportunities during World War II. So how much of a long-term impact did this all have? Well, did it have a long-term impact? There's different ways you could argue this. In some ways, perhaps yes, World War II had a long-term impact. The war gave women confidence. It proved that women could do the same jobs as men and in many cases do them better. The number of married women in work had increased after the war. So by 1951, so 5 or 6 years after the war, there were more married women in work than before, but it only increased by about 10%, so it had only gone up to about 20% of married women working, which isn't a massively significant number and perhaps might have just been a slight increase on what might have otherwise naturally occurred anyway. There was some change in attitude to married women working. Some women did work after their children had grown up, for example, so they might take time out of work whilst they had children and then later on go back to jobs. Many women willingly gave up their jobs, though, after the war, so in that way, actually, the role of women didn't change that long term after World War II. A survey showed that about 50% of people believed that a woman should stay home after marriage. Many women had given up having a family during the war and now wanted to have children. So in that way, perhaps World War II was a temporary change. Whilst there was a necessity, lots of women worked and didn't have families, but once their husbands returned from war, they went back to wanting that traditional role. Most jobs opportunities that had opened up during the war were not available to women afterwards. So, for example, many of the nurseries that the government had opened up during the wartime for free for women were closed down after the war. So that sort of opportunity for women with children to work shut down. Women continued to make slow progress in professions. Only 3% of lawyers were women by 1961, so about 15 years later. Women didn't get equal pay after the war. The Equal Pay Commission found that women mostly did different jobs to men, so equal pay was not an issue. So according to the Equal Pay Commission, they didn't believe that there was any problem with pay, and they didn't see it as a problem that women were paid differently. And the media continued to show women in their stereotypical domestic roles. So you'd see adverts showing women very excited about new sort of hoovers or washing machine technology and irons and things like that, because that's the sort of thing that traditionally women were supposed to get very excited about. So I would say in general, the wars didn't have that longer term impact on women. Probably the largest impact that it would have had would have been in the interwar period, where you saw social change start, in particular for younger women. But throughout both periods of post-war periods, so the interwar period and post-World War II, conservative attitudes return, and traditional roles are reaccepted, and the government doesn't do much to promote equality for women. So I'd say it's more of a temporary change during the war that we see women's roles and lives being affected. So that's the end of this quick revision session. Good luck with your revision.